There's a postcard sitting on my desk right now. It is small, faded. The ink on the front has gone the color of old tea. The image on the other side is a beach somewhere. I couldn't tell you which one. Somewhere with palm trees and water so blue it almost looks painted. It was written in 1984, 40 years ago, before I was born, before my wife was born, before any of the things that would eventually make this postcard matter had happened yet. I found it in a shoebox at the back of my mother-in-law's attic on a Tuesday afternoon in October while helping my wife sort through her things after Margaret's stroke. I almost threw it away. It was in a pile of old papers, receipts, Christmas cards from people I didn't recognize, a torn theater program from 1991. I was moving fast. We had 4 boxes already full and barely made a dent in the room. Something made me look at it twice. I don't know what. The handwriting, maybe. Neat and careful in a way that suggested the person writing it had taken their time, had wanted to get every word exactly right. I read it standing there in the dust and the gray October light coming through the attic window, and by the time I reached the last line, I understood 3 things simultaneously. I understood why Margaret had spent 15 years trying to drive me out of her daughter's life. I understood why she had disinherited me without explanation 2 years ago. And I understood that the woman who had made it her mission to make me feel like I was never good enough for this family had been carrying a secret that made everything she had ever judged me for look like nothing at all. My name is James, and this is the story of a postcard, a lie that lasted 40 years, and the afternoon it stopped. Before I tell you what was on the postcard, you need to understand Margaret. Because without Margaret, without 15 years of her particular brand of disapproval, the postcard would just be a piece of old paper. With her, it becomes something else entirely. Margaret Ellison was 73 years old at the time of her stroke. She came from what she always called a good family, a phrase she deployed with the precision of a surgeon, usually in contexts that implied other people did not. Her father had been a respected solicitor. Her grandfather before him had owned property. There was a house in the countryside that had been in the family for 3 generations, and that Margaret referred to as the estate, with a complete absence of irony. She had married Claire's father, Robert, in 1979. Robert was a kind, mild-mannered man who worked in insurance and laughed at his own jokes, and made excellent roast potatoes, and died of a heart attack when Claire was 19. I never met him. By all accounts, he was the opposite of Margaret in almost every respect, which perhaps explains both why they had lasted 30 years and why Claire had grown up to be the warmest, most uncomplicated person I have ever known. I met Claire when we were both 26. We were at a work conference, both of us there for different companies, seated at adjacent tables at a lunch that neither of us particularly wanted to be at. She made a quiet comment to me about the speaker's peculiar habit of saying "absolutely" at the start of every sentence, and I laughed too loudly, and she smiled like she hadn't expected that, and we talked through the rest of the lunch and exchanged numbers before we left. 3 years later, we were married. Margaret attended the wedding. She wore a hat that cost more than our catering and gave a speech that was technically warm and actually a masterclass in faint praise. She called me a dependable young man. She said Claire had always had a talent for seeing potential in people. I told myself she was just protective. That she was a woman who had raised a daughter alone from 19 and that letting go was hard. I told myself she would come around. She did not come around. Over the 15 years of our marriage, Margaret's attitude toward me stayed consistent in the way that very cold weather stays consistent. Not always dramatic, but always present, always slightly lowering the temperature of any room we shared. She was never overtly cruel. She was too controlled for that. But there was a register she spoke to me in that she didn't use with anyone else. Slightly too formal, slightly too measured. The register of a woman who has concluded something about a person and sees no reason to revisit the conclusion. I was never from the right kind of family. I had not gone to the right kind of university. My work, I run a small architecture firm, which I built from nothing over 12 years, was described by Margaret, on one memorable occasion, as a nice little business. I have spent considerable time since that evening deciding whether the little was the worst part or the nice. Claire found it harder to see than I did. She loved her mother with a fierceness that I have always respected, even when it cost me. She genuinely believed, for most of our marriage, that Margaret was simply difficult with everyone, and that I was taking it personally. It wasn't until about 5 years ago that she started to see the pattern clearly, and when she did, it visibly hurt her in a way I had been protecting her from for a long time. And then, 2 years before the stroke, Margaret changed her will. We found out from Margaret's solicitor, not from Margaret herself. She did not call, she did not write, she did not arrange a conversation or give any warning or offer any explanation. We received a letter, formal, legal, entirely impersonal, informing us that Margaret had updated her estate documents and that the revised will excluded me by name from any inheritance. Claire was not disinherited. The house, the investments, the various accounts, all of it remained in Claire's name as the primary beneficiary. Margaret had not cut off her daughter, she had cut off me specifically, surgically, with the kind of legal precision that requires deliberate effort and a solicitor willing to draft language that specific. The letter included a clause that stipulated the inheritance would pass to Claire only on the condition that it remained in Claire's name alone, that no portion of it could be transferred, shared, or used jointly with me without Margaret's written consent during her lifetime. In practical terms, what that meant was this. If Claire and I divorced, she would inherit everything comfortably. If we stayed married, the money would be Claire's in name, but untouchable in the way that money is untouchable when your marriage is supposed to be a partnership. We sat with the letter for a long time. Claire called her mother that evening. I sat in the next room and listened to the one side of the conversation I could hear. Margaret's explanation, filtered through Claire's increasingly quiet responses, was apparently brief. She said she had given it considerable thought. She said she had to do what she believed was right for the family. She said she hoped Claire would understand in time. She did not say why. Claire asked her directly, had James done something? Had something happened that Margaret hadn't told her about? Was there something specific that had caused this? Margaret said, some decisions don't require a single reason. Claire came and sat next to me on the sofa after she hung up. She didn't say anything for a while. Then she said, I'm so sorry. And the way she said it, not apologetically, but with the weight of someone who has finally seen something they can no longer explain away, told me that whatever illusions had remained about her mother's position on our marriage were now gone. We talked about challenging it, about consulting our own solicitor, about what options existed. In the end, we decided not to. Partly for practical reasons. Margaret was competent and within her legal rights, and a challenge would be expensive and ugly and unlikely to succeed. But mostly because Claire said something that stopped the conversation. She said, I don't want to spend the years she has left fighting her. Whatever she's decided, it's her money and her life, but I need her to know it's changed something between us, and I need her to live with that. So we let it go. We built our life. We had our home. My firm continued to grow. We were not hurting for money. The inheritance had never been the point. It had never figured in any plan or expectation I had held. What hurt was not the money. What hurt was what the decision communicated, loudly, legally, with a solicitor's signature at the bottom. You are not family. You have never been family, and whatever happens, I will make sure you know it. And then Margaret had her stroke. The stroke happened on a Thursday morning in October. Margaret had been alone in the house. Her neighbor, a woman named Patricia, who had lived next door for 20 years and who maintained a polite but watchful relationship with Margaret in the way that neighbors of difficult people sometimes do, noticed that the curtains in the front room hadn't been opened by 9 o'clock, which was apparently unusual enough to warrant a check. She rang the bell, got no answer, used the spare key Margaret had given her years ago for emergencies. Margaret was in the kitchen. She was alive, but she had been on the floor for several hours. The next weeks were difficult in the specific way that medical crises are difficult. The waiting, the partial information, the hospital corridors, and the conversations with doctors who are expert at explaining things clearly while somehow leaving the essential question unanswered. Margaret survived. The damage was significant but not catastrophic. She would need rehabilitation. She would need, eventually, a different living arrangement. She would not, the doctors said carefully, be returning to full independence. Claire barely left the hospital for the first 4 days. I brought her food. I handled the practical things. The house needed to be secured. Certain bills needed to be managed. Calls needed to be made to Margaret's solicitor and her bank, and 2 distant relatives who had to be notified. I did all of it without being asked. Not because I had forgotten about the will, but because Claire was exhausted and frightened, and Margaret was her mother, and whatever Margaret had done, that was still true. 3 weeks after the stroke, when Margaret had been moved to a rehabilitation facility, and Claire had caught up on sleep, and we were beginning to talk about what came next, we went together to the house. The plan was practical. The house would need to be prepared, either sold or rented or adapted for a version of Margaret's life that looked different from before. Either way, it needed to be sorted. Decades of accumulated life needed to be assessed, organized, decisions made about what to keep, what to donate, what to let go. We started at the bottom and worked up. 2 full days on the ground floor and the bedrooms. The attic was last. It was the kind of attic that exists in houses where nothing has ever been thrown away, just relocated upward. Boxes on boxes, furniture covered in dust sheets, a clothes rail with garments still wrapped in dry cleaning plastic from decades ago, a rolled carpet tied with brown string, filing boxes with handwritten labels in Margaret's precise handwriting, taxes, 1994, 1999, insurance documents, correspondence. Claire started on the furniture. I took the boxes. Most of it was exactly what you'd expect. Old financial records, receipts for things long since gone, Christmas cards in bundles held by rubber bands that had long since perished and left their marks on the envelopes, a stack of old magazines, a box of Robert's things, his watch, some cufflinks, a small framed photo of him that Claire held for a long moment before setting carefully aside. I was on the 6th box when I found the shoebox. It was pushed to the very back of the shelf, behind a stack of phone directories from the 90s. Plain brown shoebox, no label. The kind of thing that gets pushed back and back until it's effectively invisible. Inside were letters. Old ones. The kind written on paper that has gone soft with age. And at the bottom of the pile, face down, the postcard. I turned it over. I stood at the top of the attic stairs, with the shoebox in my hands for a long time. Claire was below me somewhere, in the bedroom, going through her mother's wardrobe. I could hear her movements, the soft sound of hangers on a rail, the occasional quiet of someone pausing over something. I thought about what I was holding, what it meant, what telling Claire would do to her. Because here is the thing about discoveries like this one. They do not belong to the person who finds them. They belong to the person who has to live with them afterwards. And Claire had spent 15 years defending her mother to me. She had spent 15 years believing, in the complicated way that children believe in complicated parents, that Margaret's coldness came from love expressed badly, from grief unprocessed, from a generation that didn't have the language for softness. What I was holding was not a contradiction of that. A woman who had made a desperate decision at a young age is not a villain. A woman who had been so afraid of her secret being found that she had spent 40 years keeping everyone at arm's length, including a daughter who actually loved her, was not someone to condemn. She was someone to understand, maybe for the first time. But understanding was Claire's right, not mine. I went downstairs. Claire was sitting on the edge of her mother's bed, holding a small framed photo I hadn't seen before. She looked up when I came in. "You okay?" she said. I held out the shoebox. She looked at it, then at me. Something in my face told her this wasn't ordinary. She set down the photo. She took the box. I sat beside her, and I let her read. She read quietly. That is Claire's way. She goes very still when something important is happening, like she is conserving everything for understanding. I watched her face move through the letters one by one. Her expression did not collapse. It changed, slowly, incrementally, the way light changes in a room as the afternoon moves. She read all 7 letters, the postcard last. Then she sat with the box in her lap and said nothing for a long time. I didn't fill the silence. There was nothing I could add to it that would help. Finally she said, "She was just a girl." Not as an excuse, as a fact, as the beginning of understanding something. She would have been, what, 18, 19? Claire said. And there was no Robert yet, no house, no family to hold her up. She was alone with something she couldn't manage, and she did what people did in those days, and she put it away, and she tried to become someone else entirely. She looked at the last letter, Rose's final note. 4 lines and a promise not to write again. She had a daughter, Claire said. She had a daughter who wrote to her 7 times, and she kept every letter and never answered a single one. And then, quietly, not dramatically, just honestly, Claire cried. Not for herself, I knew that. She was crying for the girl in the letters, and the girl who had written them, and the 40 years of silence between two people who had never been allowed to find each other. I put my arm around her, and she leaned into me, and we sat on the edge of her mother's bed, surrounded by the careful architecture of a life kept very tightly managed for a very long time. We went to see Margaret 3 days later. She was in the rehabilitation facility, a clean, well-run place with long corridors and windows that got good afternoon light. She had been there for 4 weeks. Her speech was slower than it had been. Her left side was weaker, but she was alert. She was present. And when we walked into her room and she saw Claire's face, I watched her read something in it that she had perhaps always known was coming. Claire had the shoebox with her. She placed it on the bedside table without saying anything. Margaret looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at me, and then she looked at Claire. I don't know what I expected, denial perhaps, or the formal deflection that Margaret had always been so skilled at, the management of a situation with just enough words to close it down before it opened too wide. What happened was different. Margaret's composure, that extraordinary, lifelong composure, the thing that had kept every conversation in its correct lane for as long as I had known her, simply wasn't there. Maybe the stroke had taken some of the architecture that held it up. Maybe she was too tired. Maybe, looking at her daughter holding the one box she had always been afraid of, she had decided that the effort of keeping it was finally more than it was worth. She said, "I was 17. Just that. As the first thing. Before Claire had said a word. Claire sat down in the chair beside the bed. She took her mother's hand, which I had rarely seen her do, Margaret not being a person who invited physical affection easily. She just held it. "Tell me," Claire said. We went to see Margaret 3 days later. She was in the rehabilitation facility, a clean, well-run place with long corridors and windows that got good afternoon light. She had been there for 4 weeks. Her speech was slower than it had been. Her left side was weaker, but she was alert. She was present. And when we walked into her room and she saw Claire's face, I watched her read something in it that she had perhaps always known was coming. Claire had the shoebox with her. She placed it on the bedside table without saying anything. Margaret looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at me, and then she looked at Claire. I don't know what I expected, denial perhaps, or the formal deflection that Margaret had always been so skilled at, the management of a situation with just enough words to close it down before it opened too wide. What happened was different. Margaret's composure, that extraordinary, lifelong composure, the thing that had kept every conversation in its correct lane for as long as I had known her, simply wasn't there. Maybe the stroke had taken some of the architecture that held it up. Maybe she was too tired. Maybe, looking at her daughter holding the one box she had always been afraid of, she had decided that the effort of keeping it was finally more than it was worth. She said, "I was 17. Just that. As the first thing. Before Claire had said a word. Claire sat down in the chair beside the bed. She took her mother's hand, which I had rarely seen her do, Margaret not being a person who invited physical affection easily. She just held it. "Tell me," Claire said. It was Claire's idea to look for Rose. Margaret didn't ask her to. I'm not sure Margaret felt she had the right to ask. But Claire decided on her own, within a week of that conversation in the rehabilitation facility, that she wanted to try. She said to me, "Rose asked one question. For 7 years she asked it, and nobody answered. I think she deserves an answer. Even now. Even this late." I said, "She might not want to be found." "She might not," Claire said, "but she should have the choice. She was never given a choice before." The search took longer than we expected. Rose had no last name in the letters. The adoption records were the kind that existed in paper form in a county archive and required a formal application and a 6-week wait. We engaged a specialist, a woman who works with families navigating exactly this kind of situation, who was calm and methodical and honest with us from the beginning about what we might find and what we might not. 4 months after finding the postcard, we had a name. Rose Hartley, 58 years old, living in a town on the coast about 2 hours from where we were. She was a primary school teacher. She had 3 adult children of her own. She was, according to the limited public information available, someone who had built a quiet and apparently good life. She had, our specialist confirmed after careful initial contact, agreed to be found. She had registered on a voluntary adoption contact register years ago, the kind that exists specifically for situations like this, where one party wants to be findable without forcing the other to look. She had been on that register since she was 32. 26 years she had been findable. Claire cried when we found out. I gave her the space to cry, and then we sat at the kitchen table and talked about what came next, about how to approach it, about what Claire wanted to say, and what she was afraid of, and what it would mean to introduce herself as the sister Rose had not known existed. We also talked about Margaret, about whether she knew this was happening, about what, if anything, she was entitled to from this process. Claire called her mother that evening. The conversation was short. Claire told her they had found Rose, that Rose was willing to be in contact, that Claire was going to reach out. There was a long silence on the line. Then Margaret said, "Tell her, if she is willing, that I am sorry, that I was always sorry, that she was wanted. She was always wanted. I was just—" A long pause. "I was not brave enough." Claire said, "I'll tell her, Mum." Claire met Rose on a Saturday morning in February. I did not go. That was Claire's choice, and I understood it entirely. This was not my story to be present for. I dropped her at the cafe where they had agreed to meet, and drove 3 blocks away and sat in a car park for 2 hours, reading nothing and thinking about everything. When Claire came back, she got in the passenger seat and was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "She has Mum's eyes." I couldn't stop looking at her eyes. I didn't push for details. She told me what she wanted to tell me, over the following days, in pieces. Rose was thoughtful and measured, and had apparently spent considerable time preparing for this meeting and not knowing what to expect. She had cried when Claire gave her Margaret's message, not dramatically, just quietly, in the way of someone who has waited a very long time for a sentence and is finally hearing it. Rose said she did not know if she wanted a relationship with Margaret, that she was open to it, but that she needed time, that she had made her peace, years ago, with not having the answer, and now that the answer had come, she needed to decide what to do with it. She was honest about all of it. Claire said she liked her immediately. They have met 4 times since then. Things are slow and careful, the way things are when 2 people are building something that has no template. But they are building it. Margaret has not yet met Rose. That conversation is still ahead. Whether it happens is Rose's decision, and I think everyone involved understands that. What has changed is this. Margaret, 3 months after our conversation in the rehabilitation facility, called her solicitor again. The will has been amended. My name has been restored. The clause has been removed. She didn't tell us. We found out through the solicitor's office, the same way we had found out about the original change. Claire called her, asked if it was true. Margaret said yes. "Why?" Claire asked. Margaret said, "Because I spent 40 years punishing people for knowing too much about me. And James never knew anything about me and I punished him anyway. That was not right." She did not apologize to me directly. That is not something Margaret is built for, even now. But she asked Claire to pass on that she hoped I understood her better than she had understood me, and that she thought, on reflection, that dependable was not a small thing to be. Claire relayed this message to me verbatim. I sat with it for a while. Then I said, "Tell her I understand more than she probably wants me to." Claire smiled. "I'll leave that part out. The postcard is still on my desk. I kept it. Not as a trophy. I want to be absolutely clear about that. Not as evidence of something I won or proof of anything about Margaret. I kept it because it deserves to be kept. Rose wrote it at 18 years old, with a careful hand and a question she had every right to ask. She deserves for that piece of paper to exist somewhere that isn't the back of a forgotten shelf. I have thought a lot, over these months, about what Margaret's secret actually was. On the surface, it is a story about a young woman who made a decision she couldn't undo, and then spent a lifetime managing the consequences of it, keeping it hidden, building a life over the top of it, becoming someone so controlled and so armored that nothing could reach the original wound. But I think the deeper secret, the one that actually drove the disinheritance and the coldness and the 15 years of being held at a careful distance, was something else. Margaret was ashamed. Not of what she had done, not really, not when you understand the circumstances of a 17-year-old girl with no choices in a time that gave girls very few choices. She was ashamed of what she had not done, of the letters she hadn't answered, of the questions she had left sitting unanswered in a shoebox for 40 years. And I think she kept people away, me in particular, someone who had built something from nothing and refused to be embarrassed by the building of it, because people who proceed without apology are a reminder to people who have been apologizing in silence for decades. I don't know if Margaret is a good person or a bad one. I'm not sure those categories are as useful as we think they are. She is a person who did something painful and let the pain of it shape her in ways that cost everyone around her. She is also a person who kept 7 letters from a daughter she never stopped thinking about. Both of those things are true at the same time. Claire said to me once, recently, that she thinks finding the box was supposed to happen. That the stroke happened so we'd go to the house, and we went to the house so we'd go to the attic, and we went to the attic so I'd find the box that nobody was ever supposed to find. I'm not sure I believe in supposed to, but I believe in the fact of it. The postcard was there, I found it, and a woman named Rose, who asked one question at 18 and heard nothing for 40 years, now has an answer. She was wanted. She was always wanted. Some things are worth 40 years of waiting to hear. I'll see you in the next one.